Carl Jung's final message about empaths isn't a comfort. It's an earthquake. What you've always believed to be your greatest virtue, your sensitivity, your compassion, might not be a spiritual gift at all. Jung discovered that many times extreme empathy isn't born from light, but from pain. It isn't the calling of the soul. It's the scar of a childhood in which you were never allowed to exist fully. Think about it. The empath isn't some chosen one meant to heal the world. They are, in truth, the child who had to give up their own healthy sense of self to survive. The child who learned to disappear, to sense everyone else's mood before even understanding their own feelings. That isn't virtue, it's survival. But Jung went further. He saw that this sensitivity isn't a mistake, nor a burden without escape. It's just one half of the path he called individuation, the psychological journey toward becoming whole. And if you stay with me until the end of this journey, you'll finally understand why your empathy has always felt like both a gift and a curse. And you'll discover the secret Jung called sacred selfishness. Have you ever wondered why you feel so much? Why you sense tension in the air before anyone says a single word? Why it sometimes feels like you're carrying the invisible weight of everyone around you? Carl Jung believed this isn't random, nor is it a mystical gift. It's a hidden programming etched into your nervous system since childhood. Imagine a child growing up in an unstable environment. She discovers far too early that her survival depends on her ability to decode the moods of those around her. Before she learns to read words, she's already reading facial expressions. Before she understands math, she understands the tone of an angry father, the cold silence of a distant mother. That child becomes a walking emotional barometer. She knows when a storm is about to break inside the house long before the first drop falls. Her skin tingles with warnings no one else can detect. Jung called this premature ego adaptation, when the child's sense of self forms too fast, not out of maturity, but out of necessity. And this is the dark secret of empathy. It begins as emotional hypervigilance, an unconscious strategy to survive a chaotic environment. The problem? That child's brain reorganizes itself. It becomes like a seismograph programmed to detect every tremor, every micro-expression, every shift in mood. This psychological radar, useful for avoiding conflict, crystallizes in adulthood into what we call empathy. But here's the core truth almost no one dares to say. Empaths don't feel more because they're more enlightened. They feel more because they learned that feeling was the only way to stay safe. And the cost of that adaptation is devastating. The child's own needs are erased. Healthy selfishness, the natural right to say no and exist for oneself, is sacrificed. Loving others becomes a matter of survival, and loving oneself becomes dangerous. In adulthood, this pattern continues. You become an expert at detecting other people's pain, but a stranger within yourself. You live everyone else's life, but not your own. It's as if you've developed a giant antenna to pick up every external emotion, while your own inner voice remains muffled. Jung saw this not only as a tragedy, but also as a sign of interrupted potential. He believed these people were halfway through the process of individuation, a journey that requires recognizing the traumatic root of empathy and turning it into conscious choice. That's why your sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's an incredible ability, one born from fear. And the real question is, will you keep living as a prisoner of this unconscious programming, or will you dare to transform your empathy from compulsion into power? If you've ever felt like you could read a room long before you could understand yourself, comment below, "I read emotions before words." This is the first step to lifting the veil. There's a part of you that was always forbidden to exist. I'm not talking about cruelty or deliberate malice, but something much simpler and far more dangerous for the child you once were: the right to put yourself first. Carl Jung called this the formation of the shadow through moral conditioning. Everything that was labeled wrong, selfish, or unacceptable in your childhood was pushed down into the depths of your unconscious. Hidden there are your most human impulses: anger, the desire to say no, the need for rest, the longing to be respected, the simple act of having needs without apologizing for them. You were taught to believe all of that was dangerous, that expressing your anger would destroy relationships, that setting boundaries would make people stop loving you, that putting yourself first was an unforgivable act of selfishness. And so, your shadow was shaped not by vices, but by the most authentic parts of who you are. Jung discovered something revolutionary. These impulses are not pathological. They are the missing pieces of a complete personality. The shadow is not a monster hiding in the dark. It is the secret vault holding everything that could have made you stronger, but that you learned to repress in order to be accepted. And here lies the paradox of the empath. The same sensitivity that makes you deeply connected to others also makes you deeply disconnected from yourself. The more you feel other people's pain, the farther you drift from your own truth. That's why so many empaths carry a silent guilt. They feel wrong for wanting space, rest, or respect. That guilt doesn't come from the present. It comes from the ancient voice of a system that once punished any sign of a healthy ego. In the darkness of your shadow lie not sins, but the keys to your liberation. And if you want to keep uncovering these hidden secrets of the psyche, don't let this be just another forgotten video. Subscribe to the channel now, because each new revelation may be the missing piece you need to become whole. The empath who never learned to be healthy in their selfishness inevitably becomes what Carl Jung called the wounded healer. Someone who gives, but not from fullness. They give from emptiness. At first, it looks like virtue. You take pride in being the one who's always there, the steady shoulder, the anchor that never fails. But behind that role lies a silent cost: resentment. With every yes you offer others, there's a hidden no to yourself. With every sleepless night, every burden you carry, a part of you is sacrificed in the name of keeping the peace. Jung described this through the principle of compensation. Anything exaggerated eventually becomes its opposite. What begins as infinite compassion, sooner or later turns into bitterness. What appears to be limitless generosity collapses into bursts of anger. That's why so many empaths describe moments when they suddenly lose control, as if all the accumulated patience snaps in seconds. Because, as Jung observed, those who never say no eventually explode. This is the cruel paradox. The more you try to be indispensable, the more you lose yourself. And the more you ignore your own needs, the louder your body and psyche begin to scream through exhaustion, irritability, psychosomatic illness. The wounded healer is not an enlightened altruist. They are someone who, without realizing it, learned to bleed so that others could stand. And this is the moment when life demands a choice. Keep being a martyr to your own emptiness, or finally learn to integrate what you were always told was selfishness. There comes a moment in every empath's journey when the entire system collapses. You wake up one day and realize you can't care with the same intensity anymore. What once fueled you, listening, helping, saving, now feels like chains. Other people's problems, which once gave you purpose, now drain your soul. You start to wonder, is something wrong with me? Did I lose my heart?
Carl Jung called this the crisis of individuation. It isn't failure. It isn't weakness. It's the psyche demanding that you become who you truly are, not just the character you learned to play in order to survive. This crisis often disguises itself as exhaustion, anxiety, even depression. But in Jung's view, it is a spiritual emergency. The soul revolts against continuous self-abandonment. The false self, the one shaped by compulsive caretaking, begins to crumble. Here, a fundamental concept enters: the transcendent function. Jung believed the psyche has the capacity to unite opposites, in this case, the compulsive caregiver and the authentic self that longs for space, boundaries, and sovereignty. It's not about choosing between empathy and selfishness. It's about integrating both poles into something greater: wholeness. And like every transformation, this process unsettles the world around you. People close to you may say, "You've changed. You're not the same person anymore. You've become selfish." But Jung warned, this resistance is not proof of wrongdoing. It is proof of growth. Those who truly love you will support your individuation. Those who resist were simply benefiting from your self-abandonment. The crisis of individuation is not the end of empathy. It is the birth of a new kind of care, conscious, selective, rooted in your own wholeness. If someone has ever accused you of changing when you began setting boundaries, comment now, "I didn't change. I just stopped hiding." This is the seal of someone who has crossed the crisis and taken the first step toward inner freedom. Carl Jung understood something most people refuse to accept. Without a solid core of ego, there is no true compassion. What we call limitless altruism isn't virtue, it's imprisonment. That's why Jung spoke of something we can call sacred selfishness. It's not destructive narcissism, but the psychological right to exist fully, to care for yourself with the same intensity you've always used to care for others. This sacred selfishness rests on three fundamental pillars. 1. Emotional sovereignty. You are not responsible for other people's feelings.
Since childhood, you believed you had to keep everyone calm, happy, and stable in order to feel safe. But that burden was never yours. Jung warned, taking on someone else's pain prevents them from growing and drains your vital energy. Liberation begins the moment you return each person's emotional weight to its rightful owner.
2. Boundaries with awareness. An unconscious empath doesn't know where they end and the other begins. They absorb, merge, erase themselves. The integrated empath, on the other hand, learns to recognize the outline of their own soul. Jung called this the development of the ego, the construction of boundaries that make authentic relationships possible, where two individuals meet as equals. 3. Legitimacy of needs. As a child, you were taught that your desires were dangerous. Now you must reclaim a forgotten truth. Your needs are just as valid as anyone else's. Rest, recognition, reciprocity, respect. These are not luxuries, they are foundations. Jung observed that a healthy individual can love others to the same degree they love themselves. When these three pillars take root, empathy stops being a compulsion and becomes choice. You no longer give because you must, but because you want to. You no longer offer from a painful emptiness, but from an abundance that overflows. This is the path to what Jung called differentiated love, caring without erasing yourself, supporting without dissolving, feeling without disappearing. If this message resonates with you, write in the comments, "I give from what overflows, not from emptiness." This is the mantra of those reclaiming their sacred selfishness. When you begin practicing sacred selfishness, something inevitable happens. Your relationships change, and that change is not always gentle. Carl Jung observed that many empaths lived in relationships built on what he called projective identification. This means the people around you weren't relating to you as an individual, but as a function. You were the caretaker, the listener, the problem solver. They didn't see your wholeness, only the role that served them. When you start saying no, when you set boundaries, when you choose to put yourself first, something frightening happens. These people feel as if a vital resource has been taken from them. It's what I call the withdrawal of emotional supply. The unlimited access to your time and energy disappears, and then come the anger, the manipulation, the accusations. How many times have you heard things like, "You're not the same person anymore. You've become cold. You're being selfish." But in truth, you didn't change. The power dynamic did.
What was once sustained by your self-abandonment demands reciprocity, and not everyone is willing to offer it. But Jung also revealed something extraordinary. Relationships that survive this transition become deeper, more authentic, and profoundly transformative. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." When you practice sacred selfishness, you discover who is truly by your side out of love, and who was merely benefiting from your silence. This is relational recalibration. Some connections dissolve, while others are reborn with unprecedented strength. And in the midst of this process, a brutal but liberating truth emerges. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your empathy. If you've noticed that setting boundaries pushed some people away, but attracted others who were more genuine, write in the comments, "I attracted my equals when I stopped accepting less." This is the secret code of recalibration, losing what was never real to gain what was always authentic. What happens when the empath crosses the crisis, faces their shadow, and reclaims sacred selfishness? A new identity emerges, the integrated empath. They are no longer a hostage to the compulsion of feeling everything all the time. They possess what Jung described as empathic consciousness, the ability to decide when, how, and even how much to feel with others. Sensitivity, which once was a prison, now becomes a tool. The integrated empath develops three essential abilities. 1. Emotional choice. Their empathy is no longer automatic. They can turn this antenna on or off, choosing when to dive into someone else's pain and when to preserve their own energy. Jung described this as loving distance, close enough to help, distant enough to remain clear. 2. Compassionate detachment. They care without carrying. They love without dissolving. They offer support without taking on responsibilities that aren't theirs. Jung described this as loving distance, close enough to help, distant enough to remain clear. 3. Reciprocal relationships. The integrated empath no longer enters one-sided relationships. They attract people who also know how to give, and in that meeting, something emerges that Jung called mutual individuation. Both grow side by side, as equals.
This inner stability, Jung referred to as earned security. There is no longer a need for applause or approval to feel at peace. The source of strength now comes from within. As Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." The integrated empath finally awakens, not to the world of others, but to the wholeness of their own being. Carl Jung's most unsettling revelation about empaths is also the most liberating. Your empathy was never, at its root, about others. It was always about you, about the desperate effort to keep yourself safe in an unpredictable world. As a child, you learned that if you could keep everyone calm, anticipate their needs, silence yourself so nothing exploded, then maybe, just maybe, you could avoid chaos. This unconscious programming eventually became what adults called your gift. But the truth is that your empathy was born from fear. And here comes the turning point. Once you see this truth, two doors open. The first is the prison, remaining trapped in the same pattern, repeating the compulsion to feel for everyone so you don't have to feel your own emptiness. The second is freedom, recognizing that what was once survival can now become conscious choice. Jung believed this moment was the true turning point of individuation, the moment you become the author of your own psychological story. Empathy stops being compulsion and becomes a tool. You don't feel because you must, you feel because you choose. But this awakening doesn't come without pain. It brings what Jung called existential guilt. It's the sensation of betraying yourself and others. The inner voice whispers, "But I've always been the helper. People depend on me. What if no one loves me once I stop being useful?" This guilt is actually the final resistance of the false self,
the identity built around compulsive caretaking. And like every symbolic death, it demands mourning. Jung spoke of identity grief, the painful process of saying goodbye to the version of yourself that was never real, but felt so familiar.
And here arises the paradox of freedom. When helping stops being compulsive and becomes voluntary, it doesn't lose its value. On the contrary, it becomes more powerful, more authentic, because it's offered from abundance, not from need. The final realization is this: you were never meant to be the emotional guardian of the world. You were meant to be a conscious individual, capable of choosing when and how to offer your gifts. In freedom, your empathy stops being a wound and finally becomes a superpower. The empath who awakens to their freedom discovers something even deeper: the necessity of what Jung called psychological sovereignty. It means recognizing that you are the ultimate authority over your own inner experience. No one else can dictate what you should feel, how much you should give, or who you should be. But reaching this sovereignty requires two painful movements. The first is what psychologists call reparenting, becoming the parent you never had. This doesn't mean romanticizing the childhood you lost, but giving yourself what was denied: unconditional acceptance, gentleness, care. It is learning to speak to yourself with the same compassion you always reserved for others. It is giving yourself rest without guilt, validating your desires without shame, celebrating your victories without waiting for someone else's applause. The second movement is facing the grief of the unlived life, recognizing that you sacrificed dreams, passions, choices, and even authentic relationships to keep others comfortable. This grief is devastating because it forces you to face everything that could have been. But Jung saw this process as essential. Only by honoring what was lost can the psyche create room for what is still waiting to be born. And the result of this passage is astonishing. When you learn to nourish yourself, your compassion doesn't shrink, it multiplies. It is no longer compassion that bleeds until it's empty, but compassion that overflows from wholeness. Jung called this state liberated love. Help that doesn't create dependency, presence that doesn't demand reciprocity, affection that doesn't trap. It simply flows. This is the true power of psychological sovereignty, no longer depending on external chaos to define your internal peace.
You become the source. You become the root. You become whole. And only those who nourish themselves can truly nourish others. But there is a subtle danger Carl Jung called the temptation of regression. After you gain your freedom, after you establish boundaries and begin living with authenticity, you will be tested. The world around you, accustomed to your submissive version, will try to pull you back. It happens in almost imperceptible ways: disapproving looks, comments that hint at coldness, accusations of selfishness. They are like invisible chains trying to drag you back into the role of the compulsive caregiver. Jung understood this as collective resistance to individual growth. The group, family, friends, partners, was shaped by your former self. When you change, they feel threatened, and the pressure is immense. Return to what is familiar so you don't disappoint anyone, so you don't lose connections, so you aren't called too harsh. But here's the truth. Real growth requires enduring the discomfort of being misunderstood. You don't need to regress to soothe others. If you do, you betray not only yourself, but the entire purpose of your individuation. As Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Do not let the temptation of regression erase this achievement. If you've ever felt that pressure to return to your old role, declare in the comments, "I choose when to care, and that makes me stronger." This is the silent vow of those who remain steadfast in their transformation. Jung's final truth about empaths is clear. You were never too sensitive for this world. You were simply incomplete. Your journey isn't about becoming less empathetic. It's about becoming consciously empathetic. No longer someone who gives until they disappear, but someone who chooses when, how, and how much to give. And precisely because of that, offers care that is pure, more authentic, more transformative. The child who was never allowed to be selfish now matures into the adult who recognizes their right to exist fully. This is true sacred selfishness, loving yourself with the same intensity you always reserved for others. If this message resonated with you, leave in the comments, "I am enough for myself." This declaration is a seal, a pact with yourself and with your individuation. And if this video brought clarity to your journey, leave your like as well. It's not just a gesture of support for the channel, but a symbol of your decision to keep awakening. And don't stop here. Keep diving into the other videos on the channel, because each one is a key to illuminating parts of your own shadow. See you in the shadows of the next hidden truth.